This is an annual event that the Center for Historical Studies stumbled on really a few years ago, of having various members of the faculty discuss issues of general interest, basically trying to think whether historians could have any conversation with the society in which they live. It's somewhat problematic and not often welcome sometimes by the recipients of our wisdom. But in any case, if you do not know about the center, I urge you to go to our website or the history department. We have some wonderful events that throughout the year that are open to the general public and, of course, to the history community. So today we have a fierce and articulate panel of people that's going to be monitored and controlled by the chair of the history department, Peter Hayes, and he will introduce the separate speakers. So thank you for coming.
Good afternoon, everybody. What do historians have to offer politicians? If your email inbox is anything like mine, you know one answer to that question. The answer that politicians have is money. I hope that the answers that my colleagues today will have will be somewhat more varied and interesting than that one. It's my pleasure to present Deborah Cohen, who is the Ritzma Professor of the Humanities, I think, actually, rather than just history, and who has joined us, our faculty this year, coming to us from Brown. To my immediate left is Joel Mokyr, who is the Robert H. Spruyt Professor of the Arts and Sciences, I believe, who is in both the Economics and the History Department. And on my right is Hendrik Spruyt, who has an equally, something Harris chair, I believe.
It's the Norman Dwight Harris chair, so I get these emails, Dear Norman. But I'm the Norman Dwight Harris.
And is it the same Harris after whom this building is named?
I think so.
There you are. So as you see, we have here today three of Northwestern's finest, chairholders all, who will address this question of what historians have to offer politicians. And when they are finished making their individual contributions, we'll take questions and interchange with those of you who've come to enjoy this event today. And I think I'll start with Deborah.
Excellent. I think I'm going to stand up, and I just want to make sure. Can everyone hear me at the back? Excellent. And in the front, presumably, too. Reviewing a biography of David Lloyd George, a man who was viewed by many as the greatest British politician of the 20th century, Kingsley Martin in 1855 observed, "People will go on writing books about him and remain not quite sure what to say." Now, this witticism of Martin's has rung in my ears these last couple of years because, like Lloyd George, one of the most surprising things about Barack Obama has been what an enigma he's in fact turned out to be. Many thought that they knew Obama, perhaps because of his own self-dissection in Dreams of My Father, perhaps because his resume, especially the community organizer part, called up such predictable associations. The conventional wisdom these days, of course, is that Obama was all along a pragmatist, a moderate, though his supporters didn't wish to see him as such. Now, what I want to do in this short talk is mine this comparison between Lloyd George and Obama. History, unfortunately, doesn't deliver straightforward lessons for us, but it suggests comparisons that, despite the vast differences of time and space, help to shake loose different kinds of questions that we might ask of the present. Like Obama, Lloyd George was an outsider, the product of a modest but respectable rural Welsh upbringing, who turned a heritage that could not be hidden into a political advantage. Lloyd George, too, was famous for his rhetorical powers, harnessed to the newest technologies of his day, of course, the radio. He was also a lawyer whose climb to the highest political office struck contemporaries as dizzyingly quick. Lloyd George legendarily had the swiftest mind in politics, which had to be deployed on many of the same subjects as occupy our 44th president, including the sovereignty of Iraq and runaway budget deficits. Reporters described Lloyd George as the best informed man in all of Europe. He had the particular, what people recognized as, at the time as a strange ability to attract others while himself remaining aloof. His smile, wrote one besotted admirer in 1914, was, as he put it, so quick and sunny, and yet so obscure. Now, what Lloyd George's contemporaries found most puzzling about him were his gyrations across the political spectrum. He was the political firebrand who rejected dogma, the hard-headed realist who was loyal neither to parties nor to individuals. Even at the moment at which his ideological convictions appeared most obvious, he chafed against the strictures of a party system. Take, for example, the most famous moment of Lloyd George's early career, the constitutional showdown that he provoked with Britain's House of Lords, the hereditary upper chamber of Parliament. It was 1909, and Lloyd George, then 46, was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the head of the Treasury. His Liberal government had introduced an ambitious program of old age pensions and other social spending, while at the same time engaging in an arms race with Germany. The government, as a consequence, needed an extra £14 million to balance its books, or, as Lloyd George notoriously put it, I have got to rob somebody's hen roost next year. And here you can see Lloyd George as the sort of philanthropic highwayman, as Punch has depicted him, with a revolver in one hand and a collection box in the other. Now, introducing his so-called People's Budget, Lloyd George proceeded to lay the cornerstones both of Britain's modern system of taxation and the welfare state. The money would be gotten from new taxes on inherited wealth and land. Daring the House of Lords to reject his budget, he ridiculed its members. Who, he asked in a speech in Newcastle, were the Lords anyway? But as he put it, 500 men, ordinary men, chosen accidentally from among the unemployed. So this is obviously a devastating comment. He goes on, who ordained that if you should have the land of Britain as a perquisite? Who made 10,000 people the owners of the soil, and the rest of us trespassers in the land of our birth? Now, when the House of Lords actually took the bait and rejected the budget, Lloyd George exulted. As he put it, at last, with all their cunning, their greed has overborne their craft. We have got them at last. And this is Lloyd George as the giant in Jack and the Beanstalk. And you can see the plutocrat who is cowering underneath the table and the bloodthirsty giant. But even as Lloyd George spoke the language of class warfare, which was really an unprecedented step for an official of His Majesty's government, he sought, behind the scenes, a way out of the constitutional stalemate. In American parlance, he reached across the aisles, seeking to form a coalition government with the Conservative Party. His immediate goal was the funding of widows' pensions. And in Lloyd George's mind, a parasitical bedfellow was better than no bedfellow at all. Now, this really was something extraordinary, right, to have essentially provoked this constitutional crisis and then secretively to try to form a government with essentially the representatives of the natural political allies of the House of Lords behind the scenes. Though this first attempt at consensus proved unnecessary and failed, actually, because he ended up checkmating the House of Lords anyway, it paved the way for his second and third efforts. By 1916, Lloyd George, partly because of his own success in organizing munitions production for the war, and partly because of his own propaganda effort about his success, was widely viewed by everyone as the man who was most likely to win the war. In this image, in the end of 1916, Lloyd George as the new conductor of the war. This is one of the very few images of Lloyd George that doesn't actually show him wreathed in smiles. But here he obviously has a task that is going to tax even his efforts. He went on to lead first an all-party wartime coalition government, and then in the immediate post-war years, from 1918 to 1922, a coalition government composed almost entirely of conservatives. He was, at this point, a prime minister without a party, and he held the conservatives in thrall. When the Tories finally rid themselves of Lloyd George in 1922, it really took on the nature of an exorcism. As the conservative Stanley Baldwin put it, a dynamic force is a terrible thing. And though Lloyd George never again held office, successive governments, Labor as well as Conservative, really quaked at the prospect of his return to power. A preference for expediency above all else made it possible for Lloyd George to keep his foot in both camps. Bipartisanship, in his hands, turned into a wedge driven between his allies. He skillfully exploited the divisions within the Conservatives, here flattering one, here deriding another as the circumstances required. The new crop of Tories elected in 1918, and here a number of inexperienced new politicians, in their number a great many frauds and mercenaries, and here I'm not going to dwell upon the parallels overmuch. This group of inexperienced politicians proved an easy mark for the Welsh wizard. Lloyd George's sunny smile and canny reserve, astute observers recognized, masked a merciless instrumentality. As the Labour Party intellectual Beatrice Webb noted, he neither likes you nor dislikes you. You are a mere instrument, one among many. There are a number of images from this time, from the coalition, that depict Lloyd George as the improviser. And you can see here Lloyd George is the lounge lizard, the improvisatorial lounge lizard. And it's the above, right, don't shy away from hooting at him because he really likes it. Now, in these days when bipartisanship is equated with milquetoast conciliation and with weakness rather than with strength, Lloyd George points an example. For Lloyd George, the historian Martin Pugh has argued, centrism was a political practice, not a coherent ideological position. Centrists are too often confused with moderates, those who inhabit the muddy realm of ideas that alarm no one. And to the end of his day, Lloyd George retained his commitment to a fair social order, and this was no moderate position in early 20th century Britain. He twisted and turned in the pursuit of constructive achievement. Like Obama, Lloyd George wanted to be remembered for the concrete achievements, for the concrete things he had done. Getting old age pensions took precedence over party unity, trumped even his own reputation as a radical. Lloyd George saw political opportunity even in the barren landscape of 1918. He did business with pre-war Tories who, as Austen Chamberlain famously said, have learnt nothing and forgotten nothing. Now, given the predictions of a looming government shutdown, it's an apt description of our 112th Congress, and let us only hope that President Obama proves as wily. I think on that score, it's easy to imagine Lloyd George's advice to Obama echoing through the decades. Keep smiling through. Thank you.
For those of you who are standing, there are 2 empty seats down here in front. There's one in the third row, I think, if anybody wants to come forward.
Are these endowed chairs?
Not yet. Now, of course, I made that offer with some reluctance because Joel is about to get up and talk, and it might be dangerous to sit that close to the front of the room.
I spit on my
Without further ado, Professor Joel Mokyr.
Thank you. So I'm, as Peter said, I am misspending some of my waking years in the economics department, and if there's anything that they believe in the economics department is, summarized in one word, it would be rigor. Now, it has been said that the only rigor that economists has ever brought to the world is the rigor mortis that sets in the people that they have bored to death. But I think that's sort of unfair. We believe in mathematical precision and not in that sort of touchy-feeling cultural stuff that people like Sarah Maza are doing. And so we, of course, believe in mathematical precision. So I thought I'd start off with a theorem. Okay? Now this theorem is also, if you refer to it in your classes, you can refer to it as Mokyr's lemma. I don't know what the difference is between a lemma and a theorem, but there must be some difference. And I'm going to give you the theorem, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the time trying to prove it to you, okay? Every compound construction that is preceded by the word fiscal is either extremely boring or politically insane or both, right? So here is an example How about fiscal rectitude? Now, rectitude, for those of you for whom English is not your first language, is somewhere between virtuousness and piousness. And I shall say something about fiscal rectitude. No. So what is fiscal rectitude? Well, it's the moral persuasion that government debt of any kind is contrary to virtuous behavior, okay? It is based on three, in my view, equally mistaken notions. That one, government is just like a household and should not live beyond its means, or any government debt is a burden on future generations, or by allowing the government to spend more than it takes in, we encourage, I like this word, profligacy, okay? That too, for those of you who English is not your first language, profligacy means wastefulness or something like that, okay? So here is a cartoon basically showing what people think about this today. This is one of us right there, and this is the national debt that has crushed us, okay? It sounds terrible. So here is a verbal example. This is from a politician who should learn from us. It's also, he is among his set, he's not the dumbest in there. This is Governor Mitch Daniels of Indiana, and this is a recent statement he made, and so talked about what he called the new red menace. That's something Republicans used to, were used to already, a red menace, but this is a red menace of different kind. This is the sea of red ink in Washington that he argues is the greatest threat to the United States' future. We face, he says, an enemy lethal to liberty and even more implacable than those America's defeated before. We cannot deter it. There is no countervailing danger we can pose. We cannot negotiate with it any more than with an iceberg or a great white. A great white, for those of you who are English is not your first language, is a shark. So, here is a response to this. This was published in 1986 by a former colleague of mine, Robert Eisner. Some of you may have known him. This was published in 1986. Eisner happened to be chair of the economics department the year I was hired, so obviously a man of very sound judgment. And he addressed this issue, although he's been long gone. And he made a couple of worthwhile points, okay? First is that the deficit is not determined just by our willingness to tax, but also how well the economy is doing. In years in which it's a decline in employment and output, there will be and should be a deficit. Is that bad? And in his book, Eisner points out it is only bad if the deficit is not even larger than it really is in years of depression, so that government action can increase demand in the economy and help overcome the crisis. I have not used the S word, right, the stimulus word, because that's sort of politically incorrect these days, but clearly that is what he had in mind. Moreover, Eisner stressed the fact, the quaint accounting habit of politicians who adding up the federal gross debt without ever noting the assets that are on the other side of the balance sheet, okay? No household would ever count its net worth or debt like that, okay? So what does the history look like? And what does politicians can... So here is a diagram of the American budget deficit over the last 80 years or so. And you can see this is pretty awful. For most years, almost all years, we have, this is the dark blue line is our outlays, the gray line is our receipts, and the difference, of course, is our deficit. Now look at this. I mean, this is, we have been pretty profligate in the past, you would say, right? So what would Representative Bachmann say in her eloquence if she could ever decipher this picture? This is American history. So you might thought, if you believed these statements about the big red menace, that the United States would have long ago turned into a failed state, okay? But in fact, the United States experience is not actually all that atypical of industrialized nations in the 20th century. How bad are things really, okay? So I'm going to cite a very liberal and biased sources, so you don't believe this at all, but because these are the socialists speaking, which is the US national debt GDP ratio, which is usually a measure of how bad the debt is. In 2010, it was estimated at 58.9%, which ranked 36 in terms of national debt per capita, a bit better than the Netherlands, a little bit worse than the Philippines, and actually almost precisely at the world average as quoted by this liberal source. By comparison, Japan, which is admittedly very profligate indeed, it's not 196.4%. The source, of course, is this very the CIA, which is, you know, certainly not to be believed, if you ask me. Okay? Now, to be sure, this is like a quick ad at the end of the midnight commercial, so I'm not going to tell you all this things. How bad was it in the more remote past? Well, here is the US federal debt going back for 200 years, okay? So this is, you can see how it's going over time, okay? It's pretty bad during the War of Independence, and then it gets more during the Civil War, and of course here it peaks during World War II, and it goes down again. If you look at this point when things really got bad, this is of course the year 2000, when Albert Gore was elected President of the United States, and so these Democrats of course can't be trusted, and they are the ones that caused the deficit to go up. Here is another country which is very profligate. This is the United Kingdom. We have 300 years of data here, and you can sort of see that the Red Menace hits them really bad at the end of the Napoleonic War, which is 1815. And as every one of my students knows, 1815 is the year in which Britain went into a long period of terrible decline, and from which they actually never recovered. And so clearly they were done in by the national debt. Okay? So for those of you who want to be really bored, here are a whole bunch of other numbers, and these are the sources, and this will of course all be on your midterm. So here's the United States. By the way, you can sort of see this goes back about a century and 130 years. The United States is sitting somewhere in the middle. We're not the best, we're not the worst, and we are sort of really... Now, here is the question that everybody should ask me. Do these numbers actually mean anything, of course? And here, candor will take over. The answer is no. The real question is, why not? And now I'm just going to talk a little bit of common sense, because that, ladies and gentlemen, is a meaningless number, unless you explain to me how and why it was incurred, right? For example, a lot of debt historically was incurred during wartime. In fact, if you look at the British national debt, certainly before the time of Lloyd George, it was almost all paid either for war or for interest payments for debts incurred during the war. Okay? So this is almost all wartime debt. Now, is that wasteful or not? That depends, I suppose, on what you think about the war. Some of it was incurred because of depressions, right? This is basically the Eisner argument. During depression, the receipts go down, so you're going to have a deficit. Some of it because government invests in valuable capital, such as infrastructure, education, okay? And as such, of course, rather than being a burden on future generation, it's really an asset for our grandchildren, which we have paid for, and they are enjoying. I'm sort of against that under the old slogan of what has posterity ever done for me, but that's, but that's how things really are. And of course, some of it is because government initiate wasteful programs, and they are too opportunistic or too feckless to raise taxes, okay? In those cases, we really should be against the deficit. But just looking at deficit numbers without paying what they were paid for really makes no sense. So this is basically the sort of logical conclusion of this argument, right? All right. Now, I'm going to be really outrageous and actually argue that more government debt could be, and in many cases was a good thing, okay? What? So, here are two arguments that I think you should think of. First is, a government that can borrow a lot basically means, okay, that there is somebody out there, usually somebody informed, usually somebody intelligent, usually somebody handling large amount of money, aren't you saying things? That basically these people trust that government to pay its debt, okay? So there is a consensus that this government is reasonably well-rounded, this state is not going to fail, because if the state is going to fail, nobody in his right mind would lend them any money, okay? And secondly, because, and this is historically I think more true perhaps than it is today, is that for many years, precisely for that reason, government security, that is to say government debt, actually were regarded as safe havens for those of us who are too chicken, that is to say in economies, too risk averse, which is the same thing, to invest in the stock market or in real estate. So if you really want a safe asset to invest in, that's what you bought. So if the government doesn't really issue debt, you know, where is going to be the safe security, right? So now, don't our grandchildren have to pay it back? Would Governor Daniels and others say? Well, here's going to be my eloquent answer to that. Meaning I will answer it, but it's kind of boring. So, theorem, but I do have an answer to that, and I will do it if people really want me to. So here are two things to take home from this rambling, and these are both quotes from Oliver Wendell Holmes. One of them you've all seen, and it's sitting at the entrance, I'm told, of the Internal Revenue Service building, and that is, taxes are the price we pay for a civilized society, which he is reportedly have said in 1904. And here is another quote, which I have not seen before, but maybe most of you have, and that is, a page of history is worth a volume of logic. And that may be something that I should take to my economics. And this is, by the way, not the same I quote about that. All right? Thank you.
I have two pieces of very bad news. First, bad news for the undergraduates who might be in the room. Joel's course is closed out for the spring quarter. You may not register. Secondly, for those of you in the room for whom English is the first language, it was Joel's third. Hendrik, you're on.
All right.
I don't envy your position.
Sometimes I might need a microphone. Thanks. First, two quick apologies. I have to run off at 1:30 because we have a speaker in town who actually would be a good addition to this panel, Joe and I, who served in the administration himself as a political scientist, but can only slice the salami so many ways. So Joe won't be here, but I do have to run at 1:30, so apologies. Second thing is I'm coming down with a cold, so if you can hear my voice, it's come straining. I'll do my best. If you can't hear me, I'll try to get in front of the microphone, which is difficult because, like Joel, to some extent, I go out of control. Before I begin, when we had the first invitation from Peter Hayes, Peter phrased it as follows: what do historians have to offer politicians? And then Joel sent around the email, sure, why not? You could participate, sure, why not? It'll take me 50 minutes to say not much. So I'll say it very slowly. I don't think Joel Mokyr can speak slowly, actually. Thank you, Joel. I'm going to approach this question a little bit different. Being a political scientist and the interloper in this crowd, I'm going to think about how politicians tend to appropriate history. So I'm interested in the question not what they learn, but how they think they learn. And I'm going to look at it from two different angles. I'm going to look at the Cuban Missile Crisis and compare it to the last Bush administration's handling of Iraq. Okay? You're a seasoned crowd, so many of you will know what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but there are also political scientists, and we have to be remembered how history actually works. Cuba's taken over, the Castro regime comes to power, Kennedy launches the Bay of Pigs invasion, is misinformed, thinks that a lot of the population will come over to the American side, or at least the invading side, and Castro will be overthrown, right? And it is a dismal failure. But that happens in 1961. Then gradually, we see a Soviet buildup in the course of 61, 62. Spy planes fly over Cuba and see that there is the Soviet buildup going on of installations, some missiles, it's not quite clear what they are. So what happens in this kind of cases? The first thing that seems to happen is framing, right? What is this an instance of? What is going on? What are we seeing? What does this look like? So what politicians in the Kennedy administration and the bureaucracy started to do was first of all think of analogies. Here are some of the analogies that were offered, and you can try them on for size if they sound plausible to you. One analogy was the Suez-Hungary link, right? In Suez in '56, the United States had come out against Israel, France, and Britain, at least they thought so, that America had come out against them and had supported the pound and so on. But what was the link? The link was that because America had focused on Suez, we had forgotten that the real game was in Europe, and hence Soviets had a free ride in Hungary. Right? So then you get the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, and the Soviets get away with it. So one link is offered by the bureaucracy that this is Suez-Hungary all over again. Cuba is the sideshow. The real game must be Berlin. So we have to keep our eye on Berlin. Don't worry too much about Cuba. Joel also talked about CIA. CIA is doing its work, high brain power at work. And they make the following analogy. The Soviets didn't put missiles in Eastern Europe, medium-range missiles in Eastern Europe. And because they didn't put medium-range missiles in Eastern Europe, they wouldn't do so in Cuba either. That should persuade you for about 2 seconds. Right? You think about, okay, medium-range missiles in Eastern Europe can't hit the United States anyway. It can hit Europe, but you can hit Western Europe from Russia anyway, so why deploy them there, right? But medium-range missiles in Cuba could actually hit the United States. This kind of fun and nuance escaped CIA. They still went with the East European analogy, all right? The Russians weren't moving into Eastern Europe with medium-range missiles, so they wouldn't do this in Cuba either. Another analogy that comes up, and this is from people who are a little bit reluctant to launch a first strike against the Soviet installations, the analogy with Pearl Harbor. If we don't give the Soviets a warning, we, in effect, will be doing the same thing as what the Japanese did to us. So the moderates, if you will, argued that we should issue an ultimatum. There should not be a quick strike against Soviet installations. So third analogy. Interestingly, not that much gets framed in terms of the 1930s. It's not so much a question of appeasement that we see here later on in sort of the second case of the Bush administration. Right? Kennedy himself starts to think of the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of World War I. Okay? So that's the initial framing of how they might approach the problem. And clearly how which analogy you buy has important consequences, right? If you believe that in situation A, X causes Y, you like Y, situation B looks like A, therefore we're going to do X again because then we're going to get Y. So clearly the analogy that wins the debate, I've got to be careful I don't trip here, the analogy that wins the debate is the one that's going to influence policy. So that's number one. Number two, as many of you who study discourse understand, if you can frame the debate in a particular way as appeasement, it becomes very difficult to disarm. Right? If you get labeled as an appeasement, then of course you have the Munich analogy. It's Chamberlain all over again, right? And it doesn't matter that you bring in evidence and say, well, no, Chamberlain wasn't really quite the appeaser that sometimes he was made out to be. He started some fighter programs 2 years before the war actually breaks out, Spitfire, Hurricane programs. He wasn't quite the appeaser and the weak person that he's made out to be. That's not going to help you. You're going to lose that discussion. Right? You are an appeaser, you are weak. So framing the debate is important. All right. Now how does the Kennedy administration and the executive committee go about handling this crisis? And that's what I want to talk about. Let's say the process of how they think history works and what one can learn from history. And here I think there's some interesting lessons that we can drive not only from the Cuban Missile Crisis, but from crisis management in general. And that is why we study the Cuban Missile Crisis over and over again. Right, the first thing that Kennedy is aware of is the psychology of decision making. I think that's Sarah Manger's coming later. Right, you should be well aware of it, as anybody who studied psychology at some point. In crisis situations, one thinks that the other side has room for maneuver. Right, one's hands are tied, but the other side can back out. So Germany, prior to World War I, thinks that Britain will not come in. It is up to the British not to enter the war. Right, our hands are tied. We're structurally in a corner, right? Second thing that happens, cognitive dissonance, new information that might go against the existing belief system is disavowed, not paid attention to. Right? Time frames seem contracted. We have to move now. We have to move quickly, otherwise we'll be too late. We can't solve the problem. And Kennedy seems aware of these things. He's aware that the psychology of decision making can influence what the executive committee is doing at this juncture. The second thing that he's aware of, what the executive committee is aware of, are the group dynamics. If the gorilla is in the room, the gorilla usually gets his way, right? So Kennedy extricates himself from the executive committee. Bobby Kennedy stays in, but Kennedy will sometimes leave the room to allow for a more open airing of dissident opinions. Right? Some of the conversations were taped, but okay, we didn't know that at the time. I mean, if you listen to the tape, at one point, Bobby Kennedy says, again, sort of think about historical analysis, we need a main, we need a pretext to go in, we need a main or something, all right? But the tapes themselves are quite revealing of what's going through their minds. He's aware of group dynamics in another sense. They open the group up to include people who are not typically part of the security community. So Dylan from the Treasury is brought in, right? A different view than, let's say, the hardcore security types. The old Russia hands are brought in, Llewellyn Thompson, Charles Waller. So you bring in people who know the case, or at least are assumed to have a deep knowledge of the case on hand, broadening the group dynamics rather than truncating the group dynamics. Kennedy was skeptical of bureaucratic procedures, the standard operating procedures taking the upper hand, that things would be set in motion that were automatic, or seemed to be automatic. He was also reluctant let's put it this way, he was very aware of the fact that organizations moved very slowly, if at all, and didn't change procedures. So during the missile crisis, he had American planes overfly bases in Florida. So, well, why are you flying over bases in Florida? What he took away from the photos were the fact that the planes were parked wingtip to wingtip, all right? That was the same thing that people had criticized after 1941 in Pearl Harbor, because all the planes had been parked wingtip to wingtip, because people were afraid of Japanese fifth columnists in Hawaii, parked wingtip to wingtip, which made them very easy to destroy. So here we are 21 years later, and the Air Force is still doing the same thing. So from that, Kennedy realized, hey, look, organizations don't always change, they're not always doing what we think they're doing. Fourth thing that happened in the exec com, they started to challenge the analogies, right? Was this really similar to Suez and Hungary? The CIA analogy about missiles in Eastern Europe was easily thrown out because people, as I just showed you, would suggest, well, no, actually it makes a strategic difference whether you're not, we have missiles in Eastern Europe or Cuba. So they started to challenge analogies. They didn't take the assumptions of the early decision-making for granted. Dean Rusk, during the crisis, he asked for reports from State Department and CIA. Is Castro really in the Russian back pocket, as we've assumed all along? Is he really that loyal? Or is he perhaps prone to go another way? There was no evidence to indicate that Castro was breaking away, but he wanted to examine, right, the pre-existing conditions. Right. Fifth, what about Kennedy's analogy with World War I? He had read Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August, whatever historians make of it, fine. But what he was interested in was the fact of structural constraints, right? France and Russia had signed a treaty in 1892, which had become public, that France and Russia would attack together, simultaneously, right? The old story that the war will be won in the very first few hours, perhaps, certainly in the first few weeks, i.e. the one who attacks the first, because you have the two-front situation, France and Russia together would defeat Germany. Germany instead, of course, realizes, well, yeah, if I'm pounced on from two sides, I need to move quicker, so I need to be the first one going to war. Then I can defeat France, put everybody on the train, wheel around, defeat the Russians, piecemeal, one by one. The French and the Russians know this, of course, so they up their mobilization plans even quicker. So what you get then is the structural determination where the game, if you will, seems to take the upper hand, where actors are moving quicker and quicker because they don't see a way out. And they liken, at least in World War I, they liken themselves to mountaineers, right? When one goes on the mountain, we all go, but we're all shackled together and I don't know what to do about this. It was that structural determination, that structural constraint that Kennedy feared. That at some point they would be both positioned in such a corner that they could not see a way out, right? And Rusk later on sort of explained this as saying, well, we fear that that the game would take the upper hand. That in fact we were not in control and we were going through motions that we could not prevent from happening. Two more points then that happened in the Kennedy administration before I go on to briefly talk about the Bush administration. You see in the decision-making process a shift away from individual metaphors. Early on, Kennedy reacts almost in an individual manner, right? He says, well, how could he do this to me? Right? As if Khrushchev had personally violated an understanding that Kennedy thought he had built up with Khrushchev. Later on, he starts to understand that domestic politics are playing a role. That maybe it's Strategic Rocket Command, maybe it's the Air Force, who knows who's pushing the levers back in the Soviet side. So opening up the space and understanding the complexity of decision-making on the other side, seeing it from the other side, right? And finally then, they started to extend the timeline. They started to ask themselves, why are the Soviets doing this? What is the pretext? Kennedy asked at one point, gee whiz, right? He doesn't say gee whiz, but he does say, what would have happened if we put missiles in Turkey? Surely that would be an aggressive move. And somebody then responds, well, we actually did. We've been building up in Turkey for quite some time. So a learning process of sort of the prelude to Cuba, and then also a learning towards what will happen next. What are the consequences for the next generation of our actions, right? So unlike Joel's economists, these guys are thinking down the line of generations to come. What is going to be the uptake of our decision down the road? Right, so 6, 7 points of I think how the Kennedy administration handled the crisis. So what is the learn of history? It's not so much World War I itself, but the lessons of how one goes about reaching decisions. And if you contrast them briefly with the Bush administration, I'll go quick, I know I'm pushing time here. That case, of course, will be quite familiar to us. In a nutshell, on virtually every dimension, the Bush administration did the opposite. So regardless of what you think about the structural outcome, if you want to convince me that Iraq was a success story, email me. I'm willing to be convinced. But just thinking in terms of process, right? The invoked analogies. Here we do get the invoked analogy, right? Remember that one, Saddam Hussein is Hitler, so we must stand up. And then it becomes very difficult for the opposite trope to win, right? That concessions are appeasement, you're giving in. Perception of time horizon. Time horizon here is perceived to be short. We have to move now because spring and summer around the corner, it's too hot, we will not be able to fight in the desert, so we have to move shortly, okay? Again, this sort of idea that horizons are very short. Inconsistencies in beliefs were not exposed. The belief that deterrence would prevent the United States from taking a hard line to Iraq, right? Once they have the bomb, we can't play hardball with Iraqis anymore, right? Conversely, the fact that the United States still had, at that point, 6,000 to 7,000 nuclear warheads would not deter Iraq from being aggressive. So there was an asymmetric belief in how deterrence would work. We would be deterred, but surely Saddam Hussein would not be deterred by our possession of nuclear weapons. Now, whether or not that belief is sustainable, at least it should have been questioned. Right. Fourth point, contradictory evidence, and I do have to read this quote. This is a beauty. This is Wolfowitz, right? You've probably heard it. They're trying to make the link between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein. And this goes into sort of cognitive dissonance, if you will, some other psychological category. Quote, just because the FBI and the CIA have failed to find the linkages between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein, just because they failed to find the linkages doesn't mean they do not exist. We have no evidence, but that doesn't matter because we know what happened, so there we are, all right? So a different sort of dynamic we had in the Kennedy administration. In this process of decision-making, time horizon, Shinseki, chief of the army at the time, says, you'll remember this well, we need 250,000 troops on the ground for the post-crisis management of the conflict, right? Wolfowitz says, no, we don't need more than 35 to 40,000. Tommy Franks, at that point, says that we will need no more than 5,000 troops 3 years after the invasion. And shortly after the invasion, this is April more or less, he says that in 3 months we will have no more than 30,000 troops on the ground, right? So they look at the best case scenario. It's going to be short, we're all going to be home, and it's exactly not the lesson that Kennedy took away from World War I, right? It's quite the reverse. Contraction of different views instead of expanding the group decision making, and contraction. If you're not on the team, you're off the team, right? Lawrence Lindsay, Bush economic advisor, says the war will cost 100 to 200 billion. We wish, right? We use Stiglitz figures of 3 billion now. Okay, but he says 100 to 200 billion is dismissed, so be fired off the job, right? Others are estimating 95 million, and Wolfowitz says they don't know what they're talking about, right? Iraq 2003 is, of course, compared to 2001, where, depending on how you run the numbers, the United States actually does clear a positive balance because of all the multilateral pay-ins of the Japanese and the Saudis and whatever. No matter, you don't have any multilateral allies here, but oil revenue would pay for the whole thing at the end of the day, okay? So very wishful thinking there as well, not paying attention to conflicting evidence. So, final point then that I want to say is, unlike the Kennedy administration, assumptions were not questioned, right? And we all know, I think, the Downing Street memo, the Rycroft memo, covers on the different terms, and the Rycroft memo states the following: intelligence of facts were being fixed around the policy, unquote. So, rather than a questioning of assumptions and the first points of what informs your belief, they in fact went around trying to create a context around the assumptions that they already had, which is we are going to Iraq from the very beginning. So in short, what I've tried to do here with briefly in two contrasting cases is not so much take away lessons of what does history have to offer us in terms of World War I looks like World War II, looks like Iraq. So not so much the substance of a particular historical episode, but how we think of history and how we appropriate history in our decision-making processes. So the analogy here would be, for me, is to think through the Kennedy process of how good decisions can be arrived at versus decisions that are, shall we say, at least open to question. All right, let me leave it at that, and we can explore them a little bit through Q&A. Thanks.
The lesson to be drawn from Hendrik's remarks is not that Harvard is better preparation than Yale to be president. It might be that Massachusetts is better preparation than Texas. And John F. Kennedy is an example of someone who was a history major. On that happy note, I'm prepared to entertain questions. Yes, Pancho.
I just have two remarks about Hendrik's comment. Obviously, you're dealing with the whole critical use of analogy. Historians, on the whole, are rather skeptical about this. You kind of have an allergic reaction. But with regard to Kennedy, well, after the comment has nothing to do with analogies, but with his previous experience. From what I've read about one of the things that affected Kennedy's judgment was his negative experience with the CIA and the military with regard to Biography. He didn't trust those guys. And that level of distrust played a role in the way he thought about it. The other thing with regard to Bush, just one other element, British intelligence actually had discovered that Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction. And when they relayed that information to the Bush administration, of course, the door was closed. So they weren't going to listen to anybody.
Right, I don't think, I'm not, do I respond?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure we have a disagreement, Frank. I mean, I'm saying that, in fact, the analogies that were invoked were questioned, right? That, and you're absolutely right, that the Bay of Pigs fiasco, more than anything, told Kennedy that we have to be cautious of wishful thinking, best case scenarios, and being sold a bill of goods by the organizations. Right? So I wouldn't disagree with you there at all.
Howard?
I heard a panel of historians recently, all of whom had either done research for or helped to write friend of the court briefs related to the Guantanamo cases. And there are probably 6 or 7 of them up at the table, and every last one of them said, never again. I'm never, ever writing for a particular political or legal purpose again. And they all decided that because they thought it completely corrupted the research process, because they ended with, or they began with the answer and then went back to say, you know, well, since habeas corpus clearly matters so much in knowing its exact scope and so on, let's go back and try to understand the scope of habeas corpus, and let's take one example. So I wonder what you guys think about that, and whether beginning a historical inquiry by asking, how can this speak to political issues, might be a problem.
I'm sitting in the lowest chair, so I don't have I think I know people who've been expert witnesses, not in habeas corpus, but actually in Native American land cases, who don't have that sort of negative impression. But myself actually living with a lawyer whose job was to prepare expert witnesses, what's also true is that you're manipulated. And it's a very skillful process of cultivation that I can imagine is inimical with the enterprise of scholarship as we all set it out. And so I know from him that my husband, the lawyer, that basically you can turn someone around 360 degrees without them knowing that it's happened. And so I'm guessing that part of what they're speaking to is the sense that having begun with a goodwill, that they had the sense that they were being manipulated.
I mean, is the problem that it's a political setting or a legal setting? I think one of the things is if you get caught up in the adversarial process of the American legal system, you begin to feel very twisted. I've had the worst days of my life being deposed 8 hours at a stretch in restitution cases.
Yes.
And there you find where you have a lawyer who is intent on disproving that this person's Jewish grandmother's property was taken away. And then you feel like you're being twisted, but you also feel like you're doing the right thing. And that and if you have the sort of knowledge that can thwart that effort, that then it's worth applying that. So that's a slightly different legal setting in which I think bringing historical knowledge to bear you can feel good about it, even though you are being manipulated as best they can throughout the process.
Yeah, I mean, working for a lawyer reminds me of the famous memo I once saw, which is, please give your unbiased favorable opinion about our decision. You know in advance what the answer is. So that really is an interesting, which is why I think most people really shouldn't do this unless they really need the money. But where I think it does matter is, and if I may go back to my former colleague Robert Eisner, right, so he testified many times, but before Congress. Okay, so he was called to the Economic Committee of this or the Ways and Means Committee, and basically asked about the U.S. economy, whether we're going to go this way, that way, and I think he knew a lot of history, and he used that history basically to make the points that he wanted to make, and they were his professional assessment, and he basically told some congressmen and senators what they didn't want to hear, some of them what they didn't want to hear, but he wasn't grilled about it in an adversarial fashion, because that's not what happens in Congress. Whereas in court, there are two guys there who are trying, one of them, or women, whatever the case may be, but they're trying to win a case. Whereas I don't think that we academics should get embroiled in this unless there's some really very good reason to do so.
You want to address this, or Michael? Michael?
Yeah, I mean, these were plenty of very, very wonderful, interesting examples. But we have treated history and politics as if it is one amorphous mass of things. I mean, in political science, we distinguish between politics, policy, and polity. And I have the feeling that politicians are pretty good at picking history for politics purposes. I mean, every politician who ever runs behind in an election discovers his love for Harry Truman and reads his biography to look for tricks and tips how not to lose this election. And then maybe on the polity level, on the large society level, there are some examples. If I look at my own country, Germany, we have done a fairly good job in making never again as part of our national rationale of being and learning the big lessons. But I think it is a policy level, the mid-level range of policies, which is really, really difficult to find the proper analogies in history to use in any given situation. So I wonder whether politicians are pretty bad at the policy level to apply history, but good for politics and polity.
Sure, I understand your question, Mike. Surely politicians use history for their own purposes, right? I think we all agree on that. What I try to suggest is that what history can actually teach us, or politicians, if they want to do the right job, is the process through which you might arrive at decisions that are better than others, right? So sure, we all use analogies, sure, we use them for political purposes, and what you ideally do is devise a process through which these are challenged and questioned. And things go horribly wrong when we don't have an institutionalized process to question analogies, the assumptions that we bring to the table, the analogies that get deployed. So that was part of what I was trying to get across, is more the process of how we think about history and the lessons we want to learn from history, which would open up for debate rather than a closure. It is dangerous when history gets closed and has a unique reading, which I think any historian would say is impossible, but then gets used for political purposes. And in fact, that's your question, but that's what I was trying to get across.
Anybody else?
I think in terms of the policy-making question, that one of the things that strikes me as most interesting, actually, from the historical record is the degree to which policies are made not in response to actually a set of failed policies, but in response to a perception about whether those have in fact failed. And so, I mean, that's perhaps the place in which historians can intervene to disentangle what, you know, you can look at a set of budget statistics and recognize versus what is a sort of general, and I mean, Joel's dealing with this, a set of cultural presumptions that prove extraordinarily powerful and durable.
I want to add one small point, and that is I think this country has been incredibly fortunate that during 2008, when our economy really turned south in a big way, as it happened, we had happened the chair of the Federal Reserve was an economist, actually knew a great deal of history, and his particular field of expertise was the Great Depression. Now, I will be the first person to immediately give you 10 ways in which our current downturn was different from the Great Depression, and that you really should be careful about these analogies, but at a certain level of sophistication, you actually know what in history to learn from and what in history to jettison, and actually get it more or less right. And I think Bernanke has gotten it, all things considered, and compared to constraints that he was under. He's maybe not gotten it right in a sort of absolute sense, but certainly he got it a hell of a lot better than I would say 9 out of 10 other people in his position would have gotten it. And that's not bad. And I think his knowledge of history, as well as the fact that at the same time the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors was also an economic historian, Christina Romer, that actually, I think, made a big difference. We'll never know how much because we don't have the correct counterfactual, but in my judgment, that it made a difference. Yes.
Yeah, thank you all three of you for your presentations. I just want to raise an issue in terms of how politics has been discussed in these circles, and then raise up a person who maybe I elicit a response from you guys. And that is, we've been talking about politics as sort of advising politicians and advising people who are power brokers. But what about politics in terms of the Barack Obama model, in terms of community organization, in terms of micro-politics, in terms of using history in sort of actually grassroots organizing? I'd like you guys to say, I mean, maybe you can't speak to that, but I hold up, for example, the historian Walter Rodney, whose work has been very influential, at least in African history. At one point, he started organizing with the Rastafarian community in Jamaica, and he wrote a book about it called Groundings with My Brothers. You all should check it out if you get a chance. But the idea that politics is not just advising power brokers, but actually creating new possibilities on the ground, and how can historians contribute to that?
I'll take a shot. It's not an area I've looked at myself, but I think that some people have looked at grassroots organizations historically. And one that they've looked at is actually the anti-cruise missile organization in Europe in the early 80s. That it was relatively small cells organizing that then funneled up to the top. So an historical study, if you will, of how grassroots organizations hinge together, I think has influenced how a lot of the other environmental groups subsequently, social movements, were organized along that model. So that is a study of history that leads to a different political development, more at your level rather than the top.
And just to say that we know that there are these handbooks of democratic mobilization, right, that are based upon historical examples of things that have and haven't worked, and that have been used, as I understand it, incredibly successfully in the last month and a half across the Middle East.
I'm a bit worried about grassroots organization, not because I'm in principle have anything against them, but rather that they can actually go both ways. And you would worry a great deal about, this is essentially like the concept of social capital, okay? So people, in political science, not so much in economics, I must say, but people in many other social sciences really like the idea of social capital, and we should really count social capital with physical capital because of connections between people and spontaneous organizations and so on. And, you know, the social capital in for what purpose? You know, what is this social capital? There's an awful lot of grassroots organization going on in Europe today that's anti-immigrant, anti-Islam, lots of things that and I find them very distasteful. But these are grassroots organizations. Geert Wilders, you know, and Pim Fortuyn before him, they came from grassroots organizations, okay? That doesn't mean that this is something that, in other words, we should really look at the content and not just at the form, okay? And they made it, and so some grassroots organizations, you know, including, of course, community organizers, seem to be really nice, except you've got to tell me what the community is being organized to do. Back there.
Joel,
yes.
very cleverly focused on fiscal matters as a way of evading questions. But I did want to raise one, particularly in an area of expertise that Joel has, which is innovation and economic growth. Looking at Britain at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, I don't think the national debt fell, but rather the GDP rose very rapidly. And if you could comment about what historians have to teach politicians in terms of growing the economy, that'd be very interesting.
Oy vey. I was really afraid somebody would ask me that question. So this is not a planted question, ladies and gentlemen. Look, I mean, I really don't study economic history so that I can give advice to politicians. I mean this quite seriously, because it is my sincere belief that one of the lessons from economic history is that the past really is a very bad guide to the future, because we're living in an age in which the dynamics of technology and growth has changed to the degree where very little that you can learn from the past can tell you very much about it. Okay, so I have been asked this question by journalists, by and all kind of, and my answer basically is I don't know, and I don't get paid to know. This is not something that we can do. All I can tell you is that by observing the long term and the medium short term in the history of the things that I study, okay, that the past really is a terrible guide to the present, because the nature of the innovation process itself gets innovated. And once you start looking at these higher and higher level of innovation, you very soon learn, you know, that we are no longer moving in a path that we have experienced in the past. Things are not only faster than they've ever been, but they're accelerating, okay? And this is a very unusual situation for the human race to be in. I mean, I waste the whole quarter teaching a bunch of econ graduates why the 20th century is totally different from anything that came before, okay? So now the next job is why the 21st century is going to be very different from the 20th century, and then studying the 20th century isn't going to give you much more of a clue than studying the 19th is going to give you for the 20s, and so on and so forth. So this is not a nihilistic view, but rather a defeatist one.
Yeah, and I'm about to take away your office in this building. Further questions? Joel really did put a damper on everybody, didn't he? Look at that. Yes. Melissa.
Peter, I hate to remind you that George Bush was also a history major.
Was he really?
Was he?
I kept asking people up here to try to figure out if that was the case.
But his grades were lower.
His grades were lower.
I had this theory that the Iraq War was a political scientist war. Not only because so many of its proponents were, in fact, either majored or got PhDs in political science, but because it really emanated from these sort of neoconservative theories about the way international relations operate. And so I found it interesting when we were talking about analogy earlier part of the discussion, because I remember many of these people, Wolfowitz and others, talking about analogies to World War I and World War II, but they did it in a sort of political science sort of way. They sort of, I've got my theory, then I model it, and then I get my empirical chapters, which really cherry-picking kind of things about just the model, and then my conclusions. And so when they would, make comparisons, say, to World War II, and, we're not fighting the Hitler of our age, they were approaching it the way a historian would do, which is to say we study things in their time and place. And context is really important for understanding that thing we're talking about in the past. So, for example, these the Bush administration types would say let's go to project of civilization uplift in the Middle East, but it just in a Rooseveltian manner, and the liberals have forgotten the Rooseveltian roots, we think. But then they were forgetting that people like Roosevelt and Truman and Eisenhower taxed the American people up the wazoo, that, if you're going to go on these projects, in basing them on the past, you have to think about how they were operated in the past, and you get this problem that Joel's referring to of huge budget deficits in wartime because you're not paying for them. Anyway, I just sort of tossed this up because no one else is raising their hand, but do you think that the Iraq War was a political scientist sport?
Well, actually, I thought you just said he was a history major.
Bush.
Yes.
But the
president.
People have been thinking in his administration.
Well, Paul Wolfowitz was a professor of international relations, right?
No, that's right. I think that, yeah, I'm not quite sure where you're going with the question, Melissa, in the sense of that political science. We could say the political scientists were heavily involved in the Kennedy administration as well. Surely there are a lot of political scientists in the administration. Is it a question of what political science does in terms of policy advice?
I think it's also a matter of thinking, how your discipline trains you to think about certain problems. And historians are trained, I hate to say that we're the last empiricists in the humanities, but in fact that is sort of true. I mean, we do look at things in their context. I mean, time and place are really important to historians. And I don't think that's particularly the way political scientists are trained to think, certainly in graduate.
Yeah, I think I'd actually have to disagree. I would have to go back to the point that what I think happened in the Bush administration was that there were quite a few people with different views. Sure, political science don't, just like historians, don't always agree on everything. But I do think that those folks who disagreed were taken off the team. That Wolfowitz and others would actually push out political scientists who disagreed with that view. There were lots of political scientists who disagreed with that particular policy decision because they knew the context. In fact, to be honest, there was a petition that circulated around about the invasion in Iraq, and almost 800 people signed that within 48 hours. I think Steve Kaufman from, I think it was the University of Louisville, started that, and lots of people across the aisle signed that, including me, including John Mearsheimer, who's a card-carrying Republican and former military member. So I think a lot of people from both aisles, lots of political scientists, disagreed with the premises that informed the decision. So.
It would still be stemming from someone's political viewpoint in some ways. I mean, it's still getting back to the way we are trained in our disciplines. I'm certain they class in political science. I was just stunned to see a pattern emerging. I mean, I'm not making this up to like make fun of political scientists. I'm just stunned to see why some of my best friends are political scientists.
Hendrik is never going to come back if you keep this up.
I serve as a member of one of your committees, and this is what I get. Well, I mean, I think there's a long discussion within political science itself, right? In terms of what is political science. Is it a science? What is the underlying epistemology? And I would say that my field, international relations, is highly diverse, ranging from postmodernists to people who believe in the logical positivist paradigms of falsifiability, corroboration, and what have you. Quantitative modeling, if you will. So, agreed that I think there's a lot of diversity in political science, but I'm not sure that political science as a whole is willing to take on the burden of this particular problem.
This might be the point to make some mention under the question of what do historians have to offer politicians. Penalty flags from time to time when they draw analogies that are inappropriate. Since we were just talking about Iraq, the one that I found most offensive during the run-up to the Second Iraqi War was the absolute assurance that the occupation of that country would go just as well as the occupation of Germany and Japan. These situations had almost nothing in common, and any historian of Germany or Japan in those periods knew that they had nothing in common. That there was not any point at which you could say these were comparable situations except that they would be militarily conquered territories. And so one of the responsibilities of historians in situations like that is clearly to raise our voices and say, wrong, just plain wrong. And we will get drowned out. Fox News is louder than we are, but we still have to do it. And I think that's one of the, and in doing so, we also stand up for something which is not popular in American society to stand up for, but which is desperately necessary. We stand up for expertise. And we are in an age when expertise is not defended, it is not respected, And we have to assert over and over again that it has claims on people's attention. And so those are things that I think we can do. Michael?
So, sometimes as a teaching exercise, we have our students do role playing. And I wanted to have Joel do some role playing.
Joel? How unlikely.
So, I recently, I teach this class 1968 to present, and I was just covering the early years of the George W. Bush administration. And I was discussing with the students a debate between Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill and Vice President Dick Cheney regarding fiscal policy and the proposal to cut taxes in late '02. So these would accelerate some income taxes from '01, but also deepen them in a certain respect. And O'Neill is saying it's going to cause the deficits to go up, and it's going to sort of unequally reward the rich. And Cheney responds, Ronald Reagan taught us that deficits don't matter. So let's say you were brought in to this debate to provide some expertise. What would you say? Who would you side with?
No, I mean, I never said they don't matter, okay? That's way too strong. What Cheney, I think, what Cheney was talking about was a somewhat, shall we say, degenerate part of economics known as supply-side economics, which flourished very briefly, but still too long, among certain fringe elements of the profession. And the argument basically was more or less like, if you reduce the tax rate, okay, you're going to get such a big positive response of the economy that in fact tax revenues will go up. Well, Reagan tried that in his big tax cuts, and of course spent the rest of his career, that they won't tell you, trying to raise the taxes back up again because he realized this was a really stupid thing to do. And I think that is basically where we're standing. I would never say deficits don't matter. I would just say there are cases when we need them, and there are cases when we don't need them, and it takes a little bit, not an awful lot of wisdom, to actually tell the one from the other, okay, which I don't think Cheney was very good at, but that wasn't his field of expertise. His field of expertise was invading countries, so as we just heard. So that isn't the point. Deficits do matter, Michael, and of course the federal government has to worry about how much money it takes on. But I simply don't think that actually is the correct question to ask. The correct question is to ask, how large do you want the public sector to be? What do you want the government at all levels, federal, state, local, to do for you? Okay? Once we are in agreement with that, then we have to find a rational way of paying for it, which may be paying for 100% of it, or maybe borrowing some of it from the investors. Okay? But that's a separate question. I don't think, unlike what Melissa was saying, that we are overtaxed in this country. We are not taxed all that highly compared to most industrialized countries, and as a net result is that our public sector actually doesn't deliver very well for us, not in terms of social benefits, not in terms of education, not in terms of a whole bunch of other things that we're supposed to do, with the one exception of military spending, okay? And so that is really the question. And the odd thing about this is, Michael, that it is of all the administrations, it's the previous Republican administration that, of course, increased federal spending far beyond anybody else done, both for the Medicare drug benefit program and, of course, for a variety of military adventures, without raising taxes. Now, at the time, I thought when they went to war that they should have raised taxes, not because I'm a big deficit hawk, but because I thought the economy was more or less at full employment, and that when you engage in something like that, you ought somehow to pay for it. But it makes a very big difference where the economy is and what it is you're paying for, okay? So if the government is going to invest in a rapid train system, rail system, or in a highway system, or in bridges, or airports, or education, okay? We should borrow because it's the future generation of people who are going to benefit from this, okay? If we're going to war to satisfy the whim of a bunch of cowboys in Washington, then maybe the current taxpayers should pay for it, okay? So that is basically the big difference, okay? Do deficits matter? Of course they do. But to label them, as the current rhetoric goes, as either really, really a thing of the devil, a red menace. I mean, this is just rubbish,
Yes, Susan.
So I was surprised to hear you say, Joel, that you couldn't use economic history to predict the future, because I thought the economy operated according to laws that operate uniformly over time.
Oh God, who taught you that?
This is a basic premise of the discipline that you're partly in, and it made me think about not so much the political use courses of economic history, but the kind of commodification of it. Like, I go to see, you know, whatever, the guy who runs my mutual fund, and he pulls out kinds of charts showing me the historical performance of the economy and talking to me about history shows this and history shows this and over the long term and da-da-da. And of course I know.
What happened to your investments?
You can't predict anything, right? But there's this, lots of people make a lot of money and get paid a lot of money to pore over this data and to pretend that they can predict the future in this way. And I just wonder if what you would say about that. This is the quantification.
These are a lot of people who haven't listened to me, and therefore they're spending money they don't have to spend. No, I'm quite serious about this. I really don't think that there is very much in the value of economic history that gives us any predictive value. I don't do it to predict. I think it's real silliness. And the fact of the matter is that, in particular in economic history, it almost always is the case that the people who study their own economies don't have a clue as to where the economy is going, okay? And I can give you many examples, and a whole bunch of economists in the 1920s were really explaining at great length why long-term serious unemployment could never occur because the economy was self-equilibrating. But you want to go back further, okay? You can go and read the sort of classical writings of the people of the sort of post-Ricardian school. Basically, they'll say, well, the economy is going to go to what they call the stationary state, right? You know, there's been a little bit of growth in our time, but this will all peter out and disappear because the economy can't really keep growing. So, you know, they are basically using the past to predict the future, and they turn out to be wrong over and over and over again. In the 1980s and 1990s, you know, most of my colleagues basically were announcing that the business cycle is obsolete. That's it. This is done, okay? It's the end of economic history, so to speak. And, you know, it just doesn't work, okay? You know, I always make this hackneyed quote from somewhere in, I think, in the Pirkei Avot, somewhere, where it says, you know, ever since our second temple was destroyed, the art of the prophecy was given to the fool. So I quote this very often in the economics department, which reduces my popularity to some extent, but I think it's absolutely true. Because, of course, anybody who really had a fail-safe method of predicting the future from the past wouldn't tell anybody and use it to make money, right? That's the sort of standard argument. So if your broker is so smart that he knows what to invest in, he wouldn't tell you because you don't pay him enough. See, that is exactly the point. I mean, economics is not a predictive science, and I don't feel bad about this because evolutionary biology isn't either, right? I mean, lots of areas of human investigation are being carried out not because it helps us predict, but because they're there, okay? And I think this is what historians do, okay? It's there. I think any historian who studies the past because he or she really wants to draw firm lessons for policy, okay, is basically a charlatan, you know?
Remember, the job of historians is to predict the past, not the future.
Post-dict.
Further questions? Yeah, Amy.
I have a question that might be a little bit
Speak up.
Inspired by Melissa. So it seems to me that we can't offer anything to politicians who aren't willing to hear us, right? I mean, if they just kind of think, you know, those are a bunch of historians and we don't need to listen to what they have to say, they're not going to take us seriously, and we can't offer them anything. And I think many conservative politicians would probably think, you know, historians are just a bunch of liberals. And then it wouldn't be surprising that a Democratic president might listen more to historians than a Republican president. And one of the things we often do with our students is, you know, try to get them to examine sources and distrust authority to a certain extent. And are we perpetuating a cycle in which, you know, politicians on the other side look at us and say, well, they're ideologically driven, the academy is liberal, everybody knows that, and so what they say doesn't matter.
This is a time of deep polarization in American society, and so it looks like that in many respects. But I think some of the times when politicians play games with history, they provide us with teachable moments. And at the moment, one of those teachable moments that occurs to me because of the series that's been running in the New York Times is about the relationship between secession and slavery in 1860. And there are people who, with a straight face, are saying that the Civil War was about something other than slavery. And most of the people who are expert enough in the study of the period and who actually have looked at the secession proclamations are able to produce documentary evidence that what they were talking about at the time was the perpetuation of slavery. Well, that's the kind of thing we can do, and we can teach. Now, teaching is, as anyone who's read the blue books in a class knows, teaching is a fallible art. And teaching makes you think about baseball averages as the definition of success. If you're hitting over 300, you're doing pretty well. That's all true, but that's what teaching is, and that's the role we have taken on in the world. So, yeah, they're not listening terribly much now, and there are some people who are so invested in their bedrock ideological positions, and this is true on both the left and the right, that they aren't going to listen to empiricism or anything. But that's our job, crying in the wilderness.
Yeah, but you know, in all fairness, Amy, I must say, I mean, I grew up in a society where history was very much at the center of our ideological upbringing, perhaps more than most other places. And one of the things that I do tell my students is, you know, be skeptical. Don't believe a word I say or anybody else says. You know, go to the sources, go to the records. You know, question authority, okay? Because the likelihood is that all the incentives are there for these people to, you know, to feed you a load of baloney, as I was fed when I was growing up in Haifa in the 1950s, and we were told all these stories that turned out to be not to be true. Okay, and so you really do want to question authority, and the first place you start with is you tell them to question yourself. Okay, so I tell them, look, this is where I stand on this debate. Here's the counter argument, okay, and here's the logic of the counter argument. Think about it both ways. And you know, and then they get a sense, well, which way is it, Professor? You know, is it this way or that way? And I say, well, you know, the fact of the matter is we can't be altogether sure. Go and judge for yourself. Find out. Don't take my word for it. Okay, that I think is a lesson that I teach. You know, every moment I stand before a class, and I really believe in it. But of course, students go home and they're not sure what they learned. Sarah?
What seems to be emerging is a sense that historians don't actually have positive lessons for politicians. That, you know, people keep saying we should teach them to distrust, we should teach people to be skeptical, we should teach people not to apply past models to what they are doing. So I have two questions. One is, can anybody think of any instance where clearly drawing on a past model was useful for a decision? And second of all, it's occurred to me that a lot of the problems that are caused by the notion that historians can teach something from historical experience is that this is based on a false analogy between societies and individuals, that because we know that as we grow older, we learn to make certain judgments and decisions and avoid certain problems, we assume that that can be transposed to societies as a whole. And it can't be, because there's no central item such as the self around which a society functions.
In answer to the first one, Hendrik gave you the classic example of the successful learning from history. It's John Kennedy reading Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August and concluding that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, if he acted rashly, if he did anything that wasn't absolutely measured, that the situation could spiral out of hand very rapidly. And so because he was impressed with the way in which that book shows the interlocking mobilizations and the tumbling into war, then he was more restrained and measured. And he said to those who said we should bomb the missile installations in Cuba, he said, no, I know exactly what that will lead to. So let's try something that is a little bit short of that and see if we can come up with a more deliberate solution. That's the classic modern example. For every one of those, there are 5 invocations of the Munich analogy that turned out to be disastrous for the United States. I mean, anyone who is part of the Vietnam generation, you know, hates the word credibility, hates the invocation of Munich as the thing that told us what we would do in every foreign policy situation. And so this is subject to a great deal of abuse.
And I think just to follow up, also in response to Amy's question, excuse me, I think one of the interesting things about post-war American intellectual life is how reticent historians have actually been to partake of the social scientific think tank culture. And how historians have, by and large, not viewed themselves as having these sorts of lessons to offer, say, by contrast to political science, to sociologists and anthropologists. And that strikes me. That strikes me also as the kind of self-scrutiny that is built into the inappropriateness of these analogies. I think that they're more appropriate, right, when they run within a society. And so you can say that the post-war labor government of 1945 in Britain learned from the 1930s, without a doubt, explicitly and avowedly. People made decisions to leave Churchill's cabinet in order to fight an election, in order not to have the 1930s happen again. But of course, that was their lifetime. I mean, so is it learning from, as you say, your own individual experience, or is it learning from some sort of magisterial history?
Yeah, the other thing always evoked is the European right after 1945, right. The acceptance of the welfare state, the willingness to work and bridge class divides, because people had seen what class warfare did in the 1930s, and that's the other one that's invoked. Joel had to go teach.
Is she the next one out and you're left alone?
Yes, it's true.
It's not going to work like that. I'm about to head that off. Joel had to go teach, and I'm sure some of the rest of you do too, so I think we should probably stop here, but there's still refreshments at the back of the room, and we can linger and nosh and so forth.